Hi. Today I am going to explain a comedy and fantasy movie called Bruce Almighty. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. At the beginning of the movie, we see Bruce Nolan. He is a television field reporter for Eyewitness News on WKBW TV in Buffalo, New York. And he was covering the news of the town's biggest biscuit. While covering the news, he was frustrated. Later, we see Bruce and his girlfriend Grace are watching tape of that news. He was angry because his channel always gives him weird news to cover, and all good news to his rival Evan Baxter. In the next morning, he sees his favorite team has lost the game. Then he sees Grace's dog is peeing on couch, and then Bruce picks him up and comes outside, but now the dog's tank was empty. Later, he drops Grace to school because she is a teacher. Before leaving, she gives him a good luck charm for his good luck that her students made for her. He then moves to his office, but he stucks at a long traffic. Then he blames his luck and God. And he was late. In office, his rival Evan teases him about that big cookie news cover, but Bruce wasn't also an innocent guy. He also teases him with his special talent, and all laughs. Later, he asks his boss to give him some spicy and standard news to cover. He complains that Evan gets all the good news. Then his boss tells him that he is a good reporter and he makes people laugh, but Bruce wants to be a standard reporter, not a stand-up comedian. Then his boss gives him an opportunity to cover a live news, and he becomes very happy, and tells this to Grace, and she was happy for him. Later, while covering the news, the studio announces that Pete is retiring from anchoring, and their channel's new anchor is now Evan Baxter. Hearing this, he becomes extremely angry, and starts asking foolish questions to host. Like why she let Leonardo DiCaprio drown, while she was safe floating on a big door. And he asks a man, "Am I not good for anchorman? Is my hair sucks? Is my teeth sucks?" And he was angry on God and blames his life. And after that news, he got fired. And teases to TV channels short form. While leaving, he notices some street junks are stealing money from a homeless man, and he tries to help him by saying, "Leave that poor person alone." Meanwhile, they were ashamed and leaves, but our friend Bruce hops on level 2 where he teases them. Hearing this, those bullies get angry and attacks on him, and beats him so hard. At home he was frustrated, and Grace says, "Everything happens for a reason." And Bruce says it's a bullshit. He says God is ignoring him, and he also argues with Grace, and then he leaves the house and goes to find God, and he asks give him a signal, then he gets a signal, then he asks for a sign, and he also gets a sign. Then he grabs that lucky charm and asks God that give him a miracle, but accidentally he falls that lucky charm, and when he crashes to a pole. Seeing that lucky charm, he throws in the sea, and asks God to strike a lightning on him, and says, God should be fired from his job, and he is the only one who is not doing his job. Meanwhile, his pager rings but he declines it. In the next morning, his pager rings and he discovers the same number from yesterday's night. Later he throws his pager outside, on road, and it breaks by a car. Meanwhile, he discovers that Grace has left the home. And he sees Grace's dog is peeing on couch, then he grabs him and comes outside, and teaches him the tree is bathroom and that is house. Then he hears, his pager is still ringing, even though its wire is broken. And he sees same number that he got earlier. Then he calls on that number, and discovers that he knows his name and everything about his situation. Then he notes the address, and goes to meet him. When he arrives, he accidentally wets his pants, and again blames God. Later he enters in an empty warehouse. He was looking for room number 7. But there were 4 different rooms, and he don't know which one he should go. Then he sees a janitor. He says, "Looking for room number 7. Bruce says yes, but there are 4 of them. Then janitor tells him that it's on 7th floor. Then Bruce looks for lift, but he says it's not working. Then he takes stairs. While going, janitor asks him to help him with cleaning, and says, he is now busy but he will be free on 7th on 7. Later, he arrives at room number 7, where he discovers a ladder, and there is someone who was working there. Later he comes outside, where Bruce sees janitor. And he asks him the lift was broken huh? Later he claps and turns off the light. Bruce thinks it works on clapping. Then janitor starts to dance, and Bruce is about to leave. Then janitor removes his uniform, and Bruce sees him on white suit. Then Bruce jokes about him, and he says you are funny. And he also tells him about his father. Hearing this, Bruce was surprised, and asks him, how do you know about my father, and how do you got my pager number? Then he tells him he know a lot about him, and he have a desk of his life. Whatever he says, it saves in that desk. Then he opens it, but it was very long. Then janitor closes the drawer, and he reads what Bruce said about God a few days earlier. Then Bruce says, are you spying on me, and who are you? And he says, I am God. Bruce was thinking he is lying, and says this desk is just an illusion, and there must be a hole that connects two rooms. Then God slides the desk and he finds nothing there, and he says, that's a good one. Then he asks God to tell him how many fingers he is holding, and God gives all correct answers, but the last one, Bruce shows 5 fingers but God says it's 7. When he reveals, he discovers 7 fingers on his hand. God says, I am hearing some complaints about Bruce, and he is tired of them. He says, you think you can do this job better than me, so I will give you this job. And when you will leave this building you will got my powers. Then Bruce runs away, and still not believes that he was a god. When he tries to start his car, it wasn't starting, but when he says start, it starts. Then he goes to a cafe, where he tests his power. Then he makes a valley of tomato soup, and he was enjoying doing that. Then God comes to meet him, and takes him outdoor. And God tells Bruce that he cannot tell others he has God's powers in order to avoid the media attention, nor can he use the powers to alter free will. Bruce is initially jubilant with the powers, using them for personal gains, such as blowing wind on street, exchanging clothes with just a wish, and exacting revenge on a street gang that bullied him earlier. He asks them to apologize him, and he will let them go. But Street Junks starts laughing. Their leader says if a monkey will come out of his butt, they will apologize to him. Soon after, monkey comes out of his butt, and he falls. Seeing this, they think it's a voodoo, and runs away. As a return gift he sends bees on them. And later he says to monkey to go home, and few seconds later that monkey goes to home happily. At night, he gives Grace beautiful flowers, and then he pulls Moon by his invisible rope, and adds some more stars on sky, and impresses Grace. And later, they make some wild love. In the next morning we see on the news that because of Lunar's unusual activity, in Japan a big tsunami occurs. Later, we see Bruce wakes up and hears praise, wishes, and apologies. Then he sees Grace's dog is about to pee on couch, but he orders him to use toilet. Now, he becomes professional, and got some manners. On the breakfast, Grace tells him that her breasts are now bigger, and she doesn't know how this happened in one night. Later he goes to get his job back, and he turns his car into a cool supercar. While going he gets along traffic. With his powers he splits those cars and drives through them. Then we see a reporter is covering Police Dog's news, and are going back, where he see Bruce and recognizes him, the guy who went crazy on live news. And he says there is nothing to cover here now. A few moments later, Police Dog is digging and he founded a dead body. Hearing this, that reporter tries to take the cameras, but Bruce locks the doors with his powers. Then he covers all the news. And he was the first who covered this news. And then he goes to his office, and everyone in the office congrats him for this news, and he also got attention from a lady, who was always used to ignore him. Then his boss congrats him and asks him to come back. Bruce asks to placement him as an anchor, but his boss refuses, and says it's not in his hands, there is some big people out there. He agrees to work as a reporter. Then we see him covering a kook of news, but he wanted more spice in it, so he uses his God-given powers to crash a meteor on Earth, and covers the news while running. Then all TV channel begins to talk about him, and they nicknamed him Mr. Exclusive. And we see now the Grace's dog is also unlocked his God-level powers. Later we see Evan is covering a forecast news, and Bruce uses his powers and controls his body, and he does foolish faces, and reads that he should not speak. Later Bruce takes Grace on a dinner at an expensive restaurant, where he tells her that he promoted as an anchorman. But Grace was expecting him to ask her marry. In a meanwhile, he hears people's prayers and wishes. Then he comes outside and he was anxious. Later he sees himself on top of the Mount Everest, where he meets God, and asks him about voices in his head. Then God says they are prayers. And God asks him, how many people you have helped since I gave my powers to you. At home, he think about to help people, because too much prayers were annoying him, so he should manage all the prayers. And he decides to organizes all praise into files. Then he thinks to organize them into post notes. Finally he uses new technology, and starts downloading all the prayers in computer. And it take him a night to download 1.5 million prayers. And starts working on them. When he think he finished, he got 3 million more. Then he sets it to yes all prayers. Then we see a big party where all people discussing about their wishes coming true. Later we see Bruce in a corner and he sees his coworker flirting with him. Later, he calls Grace, but Grace doesn't answers the phone. Then Bruce uses his powers to convince her by controlling her dog. Then she sees a film where a guy says that he will pull moon on Earth. And her car's keys falls on her, and her dog also convince her to go. Sometimes later his coworker enters the room, and asks about his and Grace's relationship. Then she starts to kissing him. First he refuses but later he enjoys. Later we see Grace arrives at party and sees them kissing, and she leaves. Bruce then tries to convince her, but she wasn't ready to believe him. Then she left. Then he comes back at party, and enables fire safety system, causing rain in the house. And all people goes outside. Then he sits on sofa where he sees on news, that all people who bought lottery tickets, they all wins the lottery. In a meanwhile, God arrives, and Bruce says Grace left him. And he wasn't able to make her love him. Because it will affect free will. Then God says, welcome to my world, son. If you got this question's answer, let me know. In the next morning, Grace hears, forgive Bruce, on radio. Later she goes on walk where she sees her and Bruce's name on tree. Later, she goes to cafe, where she sees Bruce's name on TV. And she was confused about it. When she was closing windows, she discovers a message from Bruce. Later we see Bruce comes to school. And he apologizes her, but she refuses. Later he uses his power on Grace to fall in love with him. Because of free will, he wasn't able to do it. And she walks away. Then we see on news, that the last week's meteor strike damaged the Transformers. And people are protesting about that lottery. Then we see that scientist thinks that world is coming to end. Later we see Bruce as TV anchor, and his boss tells him that talk on the angry crowd, is surrounded by their building. Hearing this, he leaves, and sees people are destroying the streets. Some are stealing pizza. Some are stealing candy machine, and some throws rocks on windows. Then he says God. And teleports to that previous building, where he met him first time. Then he climbs ladder and calls him by clapping. Later God calls him Bruce Almighty, and Bruce sees God, and he says everything is out of control. Then God says it's God business. It is not easy. Then God says, you are on time. Then Bruce checks his watch and he sees 7th at 7. Previously when he came for the first time, God asked him to help with cleaning. Then Bruce helps him with cleaning. Then he asks God how he can help people without getting in trouble. Then God says if you want to see miracle, be the miracle. Then he leaves. And Bruce asks him what if he get in any problem. Then God says it's everybody's problem. Keep looking up. Then he unplugs the cable of computer. Then we see Evan is packing his stuff, because Bruce was anchor. Then Bruce arrives, and says Evan you deserves anchor position, and Bruce resigns that position. Then he helps people without using his powers. Later he tries to motive his dog to teach him some toilet lessons. Then he moves his couch to outside where his dog can pee. After some hard training days, his dog finally learned. Then we see Grace's sister Kate. She came for collecting Grace's stuff. While leaving, Kate tells him that every night before sleeping, Grace prays. And most of the time she prays for Bruce. Then Bruce checks it on his computer. And surprises seeing a lot of prayers about him. Then he sees that she is now praying. Then he uses his powers, and sees her from his window. And sees her praying to God. She says, she still loves Bruce, and she wanted to live with him again. Later we see, he realized his mistake. And then he walks on street, in heavy rain. Then he says to God, you win. And he do not want to do this anymore. And he don't want to be God. You decide what is good for me. Then a truck hits him, and he straight goes to heaven. Where he asks, am I dead? Then God says, when you talk in the middle of the highway, it's happens son. Then God says, you brings smile on people's face. Then he gives him lucky charm, that he throwed before. And asks him to pray. Then Bruce prays, feed everyone, and bring peace, to all mankind. Then God asks him, what you really want? Then Bruce says, Grace. Then he asks, you want her back? Then Bruce says no. And he says she will find someone who will better than him, who will make her happy. Then we see he is getting shocked. Then we see medical team is trying to save him. When he wakes up he sees doctor. He says you are very lucky to be alive. Later, he sees Grace. She was sad seeing him like this. Then she forgives him, and hugs him. Later, we see that lucky charm in his hands. When he recovers, we see blood donating campaign that Bruce was covering, where we see a big injection cookie made for this occasion. While covering, he makes people laugh. Then he announces Grace as Mrs. Exclusive. Then we see, he and all people encourages to donate blood. In the end, we see homeless guy whose face turns into God. Then he claps and makes to go light off. Watch more videos like this, subscribe, turn on notification, and leave a like. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.